Can you hear me without the microphone?
Yes.
Freaks me out to hear my own voice, so I'd rather not use the microphone if possible. If you can't hear me, I'll talk more loudly. My name is Greg Nordin. I'm the Director of Planning at RIPTA. I've been with the agency for a little over 7 years, and I've started as a lowly entry-level planner and kind of clawed my way up. So I've seen a few different sides of the conversation at RIPTA, but I'm here today just to talk about sort of RIPTA's perspective on transit-oriented development, more specifically my own. I will try not to editorialize too much, but if you know me at all, I'm sorry. So I really approach this from just trying to think about 4 questions that I wanted to answer. And I think the first one is obviously the most baseline question is, what is transit-oriented development? I'm specifically addressing that from the perspective of a transit agency, and what does that mean for transit agencies? So I mean, we all know what transit-oriented development is, and John gave a great definition at the beginning. I'm trying to think about it a little differently. What does TOD mean for transit? Also then I want to talk specifically about some of the things that RIPTA is doing right now that are really preparing us for TOD. We know that it's coming. Clearly it's already happening in Warwick. There's a new Pawtucket train station that's going to be opening. We have several train stations around the state where there's a lot of focus on bringing development there. So I want to talk about some of the things that we're doing at RIPTA to help really set ourselves up for success there. And then I want to talk about what we think transit will look like in a TOD environment. This is maybe a little more general, and it's just taking the lens back a little bit and talking about what actually needs to happen for transit to function in a way that actually makes people get out of cars and walk and use bikes and not rely on their cars to get around. And then the 4th question is, what can municipalities do to support transit that supports TOD? And that sounds like a strange question, but the reality is I think a lot of people seem to think like, yay, transit, it's a good thing, but then they get into the weeds of it and they realize it's a lot messier and uglier than they thought it was, and it's not as beautiful as a nice little bow of a streetcar showing up at your front door. So, this is just some helpful hints to help municipalities and planners think about what are the requirements of transit to help support the TOD development. So when talking about TOD from the perspective of a transit planner, I just automatically said, well, let's just talk to the FTA. So this is actually the definition that is on the Federal Transit Administration's website. I'm not going to read this whole thing because it's really long. So I'm just going to focus on the middle part here, right here. And it really just says successful TOD depends on access and density around the transit station. Convenient access to transit fosters development, while density encourages people to use the transit system. Focusing growth around transit stations capitalizes on public investments in transit and provides many benefits, including, and then it goes into all these great benefits. So it's the FTA is really, their perspective here is that TOD is really contingent upon making transit accessible and friendly to use and easy to use, and also something that is desirable and that people want to use rather than they're using it as an option of last resort. So that's sort of the framework that we approach TOD from at RIPTA. That we want to make the transit service as accessible as possible to people and really make it something that people are excited to use. So what it comes down to really is that to make transit successful in a TOD environment, and it's sort of the baseline, there's really 4 pieces to it, and it's frequency, speed, high quality stops and stations, and good connections. And so frequency is just basically how often are your buses or your trains showing up. Is it once an hour? Is it once every 5 minutes? Is it 3 times a day? Really, those types of questions really help define how people use your system. If you are a transit system where a vehicle arrives every hour, that is a very difficult option for many people, because you can't wait an hour for the next vehicle to arrive. If you miss it, and it's hard to plan your life around it. It requires a lot of frequency to support a good transit environment. Additionally, speed is important. If it takes you 4 hours to do something that you might do in a car in an hour, you're going to always drive. So really investing in technology or ways to improve the speed of your transit system are incredibly important. The 3rd bullet here for transit supporting TOD is high quality stops and stations. And this is really just making your service attractive. If you're standing at a bus stop in a culvert on the side of the road and you're getting splashed by every truck that comes by, or it's dark or it's cold and there's no protection from the elements, you're not going to utilize that option. If you think about places where maybe you use transit in your life, it's usually you're drawn to locations that provide some protection from the elements, make it feel a little more friendly. And then the fourth part is probably the most important. That's just good connections. Good connections, and that's basically, is transit taking you where you want to go. If you are, if the bus doesn't or the train doesn't actually go where you need to go, it's kind of an irrelevant project or a relevant service. I like to think about a lot of the streetcar projects in the early 2000s that you read about now that they're shutting down or critically rethinking, and it was because they built these projects that really didn't take people anywhere. They were vanity projects to say, we have a streetcar. And the reality is that streetcar didn't go anywhere. And so, why would you wait for a streetcar that's not taking you where you want to go? Good transit needs to take you where you want to be. So, what is RIPTA doing to promote TOD? So there's a few initiatives that we have going on. I've broken this up into 2 slides. These are all the planning efforts we have currently going on. So as John mentioned, the state is undertaking its first transit master planning effort called Transit Forward RI 2040. That project has been underway for about 6 months. We've been doing a lot of background data collection, and we have our first set of public meetings coming up next week on that project. I'll have more information on those later on in the presentation. But that project is really focused on where is the state going as we develop our system. And we're taking a holistic look at all modes, so we're not looking just at bus, we're also looking at rail, we're looking at ferries, we're looking at, let's see, what else we're looking at. Well, we're looking at a bunch of things. And the whole point of that project really is just to pull the lens back, have a conversation about what the state looks like, where are we growing, where are we shrinking, does it make sense that the way our system currently operates, where do we need to make investments to make transit attractive for people. It's a really exciting project, and if you haven't heard about it yet, I would encourage you to check out our website. It's good stuff. Additional planning efforts, we've actually completed a bus stop design guide in 2017 that helps set standards for what we expect our bus stops to look like, acknowledging that we are not always able to meet those standards, but it's a guide for municipalities to at least understand what we're looking for when we say we need a bus stop here. Is it just a sign on a telephone pole, or are we looking for something more? Additionally, in 2017, we completed a transit signal prioritization expansion plan. This really focuses on helping our buses move more quickly through the system. Our buses on the R line, our highest frequency route in the system, currently can communicate with traffic signals. It gives those buses a slight priority over general traffic, and it makes those buses move more quickly down Broad Street and North Main Street in Providence. We've also completed a fare study in 2016 that took a comprehensive look at all of our fares and how we collect them. And that has led to a new project we're working on that I'll talk more about. But this is, again, really focused on making our system as easy to use and easy to understand as possible. And then in 2012, we completed a comprehensive operational analysis, and that took a look at all of our existing services and in a revenue neutral way, basically reapplied those resources across our system so that we were serving our passengers most effectively. On the capital side of our work program, these are the things that we're doing to help promote TOD from that end, and that's really focused on a few large projects. First and foremost is the Pawtucket Bus Hub and Transit Emphasis Corridor. In Pawtucket, they're building a new train station for MBTA service along the Northeast Corridor. We are relocating our current operating hub from Roosevelt Avenue in Pawtucket to that new location, and we'll also be making improvements to Exchange Street to help connect the core of downtown to this new train station and also make it more accessible for passengers to get to that facility. This is our second busiest bus hub in the entire state. It has about 2,000 people a day that use that stop, and has 9 bus routes that come into that corridor. So we're expecting to see a pretty big return on our investment on that project. Additional capital efforts, we have in 2020, the downtown transit connector will be coming online. We recently started construction on that. That is a high frequency corridor in downtown Providence that provides a bus every 5 minutes to connect Rhode Island Hospital to the Providence station in the north. And it's going to have the state's first bus-only lanes. It will have highly branded, highly visible, specifically branded shelters. We'll have painted bike lanes, transit signal prioritization, transit-only signals. A lot of investment we're making to help make transit more accessible in downtown Providence, and also to help really draw help draw new businesses to the jewelry district where there's a lot of development going on, just making it more accessible for people who are commuting in from Boston or elsewhere. Other projects we have that are promotion of TOD, as I mentioned before, our fare study, that has led to our fare collection system upgrades. We are actually in the process of upgrading our fare collection system to be more state-of-the-art. So this upcoming summer, you'll be able to board a bus using a smartphone. You'll be able to create an account online and add value, and you can manage your family's accounts and all kinds of fun stuff, and there's no more paper media, no more need to go to Kennedy Plaza just to buy a bus pass. You can do it all right from your phone or from your computer. We're also expanding our transit signal prioritization program. As I mentioned on the R line, we saw a huge increase in our operational efficiency on that corridor and really made those trips a lot quicker. So we're expanding that to 5 other corridors in the state, including Eddy Street, Broadway, and Elmwood Avenue in Providence, and then East and West Main Road in East Bay. And then finally, in 2014, this is probably our largest project to date, we partnered with the City of Providence on the development of the R line, where we improved bus service along 2 of our highest ridership corridors in the state. And then that service, to complement that, the city undertook a zoning rewrite where they created TOD overlay zones along that corridor to really incentivize growth along that corridor and really help reinforce our investment. That is a phantom slide that shouldn't be there. I apologize. So when you're designing transit for TOD, I talked a little bit about those 4 tenets, but really the thing that really drives it from the development perspective is density. And as you have more dense environments, it can support more transit. And so part of what we do at RIPTA is we're actually looking where Rhode Islanders live. So this is a lovely little map that shows sort of the densest parts of the state. This is taken from the 2010 census, so it's getting to be a little out of date, but 10-year censuses. This is showing where Rhode Islanders live, and then we combine that with where they work. And so this is just a map showing employers that have locations with more than 100 employees. And we basically overlay those 2 things, and we create what's called a transit propensity map. And so this is basically saying, where do people live, where do they work, and what demographics do they have that would maybe make them more likely to use transit. And this is really what guides us for how we plan for transit in the state. And so when you're thinking about TOD, it really does come down to just having an abundance of people and jobs. This is actually taken from our Transit Forward RI 2040 plan. And it's really just looking at the yellow parts are sort of where you're getting into some level of transit support. I believe that's $1 an hour. And then the dark red, it can support transit that comes every 10 minutes. Currently in Rhode Island, we only have 1 route that operates every 10 minutes, the R line. And so you could actually make an argument that in general, Rhode Island is underserved by transit. Something that is a little sad, but is true. And so, yeah. So now on the other side of this, talking a little bit about what municipalities can do to support transit. This is just really meant to show that, municipalities, I think, have a misunderstanding of what transit means for their communities. And this is just showing that, we have bus stops. We actually track ridership at these very closely, and we have a pretty good idea of who's boarding our bus where. And so when we're talking to municipalities about bus stops, we get a lot of concern about, well, there's people waiting at the stop, or they're loitering, or business owners can't, they don't have parking in front of their business anymore because there's a bus, people waiting for a bus, or all these excuses or whatnot. And so when we talk to them, I think there's a misunderstanding about what actually occurs at a bus stop. So this is just meant to show you that we have somewhere in the neighborhood of about 4,000 stops in our system currently. And this tells you the number of stops that actually have, what the ridership looks like at those stops. So if you look at the very bottom, of 4,000 stops, about 5% of our system, or about 200 stops, actually account for, close to 70% of our system ridership. So those stops are what we consider critically important and need investment and need support from municipalities to thrive. You'd be surprised at the number of those stops that actually we get complaints about and ask to remove those or relocate them or take them out completely. That happens probably about 2-3 times a month. And unfortunately, it's tough because Those are people that are relying on those stops to get where they need to go. And I always like to frame this in the context of that bus stop. You know, does not take up a lot of space. And when you think about 70% of our riders, or about 40,000 people a day, use those 200 stops. If you think about the amount of space that we need to park the same number of cars, it's an efficient use of space to think about bus stops as a good investment. So this is actually meant to show, this is taken from our bus stop design guide. This is meant to show what our ideal bus stop would look like, barring all, you know, any specific conditions of a specific place. And it really sort of underscores the fact that buses don't take up a lot of space. It's about 2 to 3 parking spaces on average when you're creating a bus stop, and that can support hundreds of people a day having access to businesses and services in your community. Why did it not switch? There we go. So this is just a rendering taken from our bus stop design guide that shows Broadway and Providence. Broadway at, I don't remember the intersection, Knight Street, I believe. And this is just showing that you can, you know, make, with modest improvement, you can actually carve out a space for buses, and you know, provide adequate accommodations for passengers who might be using that. So I think the second piece of advice that we have for municipalities, RIPTA, is really, when you're crafting policy, just keep us in mind. This is something that I think we get left a little bit to the side sometimes, especially when it comes to parking policy. It's very difficult to get people out of cars when you give them an abundance of free parking and then wonder why they don't take the bus. You know, it's just, it always kind of blows my mind when we think about that. Am I going really long? I'm sorry, John. I will wrap it up. The third bullet here, really the third piece of recommendation or advice that we have when municipalities are thinking about transit and supporting TOD is just be the advocate that you wish to see, or for the transit that you wish to see. And I think that this is really tough because everyone has this idealized version of people riding bikes and riding buses and walking everywhere, but then the policy doesn't always reflect that, or the practice doesn't always reflect that. And it's really difficult to make headway when, you know, you have policy that doesn't support good transit. And then really the fourth thing, and this is probably the one that my staff was most adamant about when I was telling you about this presentation today, is really just support development areas with existing transit service. If you're developing TOD, don't permit buildings that are 1.5 miles from a transit line. It just doesn't make sense. And really what happens is in the bottom there you see sort of 3 routes, and if you have a main route and then you suddenly allow a business to build 3 to 4 blocks away, and you expect the bus to deviate for that, you create all these weird things where it makes transit unreliable and people don't understand it, and it just gets very confusing very quickly. If you're encouraging development close to transit lines that already exist, it's just a more efficient use of resources. So this is just a few resources if you're interested. Obviously, RIPTA.com, you can find copies of our bus stop design guideline. I would encourage everyone to check that out if you have a chance, as well as our TSP expansion study. TransitForwardRI.com, this is our website for the transit master plan that we're working on with statewide planning and DOT. We have our first public open houses next week, December 11th and 12th. We're holding a meeting in Providence, Woonsocket, and Newport. There will be many, many, many meetings coming up on that project, so if you can't make that one, don't worry, there will be other opportunities. Plus, you can engage on our website. And then if you need to contact me, my information is down below.
Fantastic.